All right. And welcome back, guys, to the Self Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hageman, and today, what are we talking about? Well, for starters, I have been talking way too long to myself in an empty room for way too many minutes today. So had to reorient, and simply that means I had to move it down to the floor. This seems like the appropriate place to be given the headspace I'm in. Coming at you today with the solo episode. And what are we talking about? A lot of the podcast content has been related largely to fat loss, adherence, building muscle, PEDs. And I think within each of these subcategories, there's definitely overlap in a lot of the message that I put out and that I really try to instill. And really the purpose with sharing any of this, sharing it at this point, you should be getting this, maybe potentially could even be episode 50 or close to that, somewhere around there. We're close, we're not far off. The idea behind sharing this long form content is really to give you hope. See, I know that sounds cheesy, but to give you hope that hey, some of the shit that you're going through, some of the problems that you're having, other people experience them too. You can get through them, you can work through them, you can get over them, you can decide this isn't a fucking problem anymore. I'm not going to let this consume me. And I think for the longest time, when I got into the space, there were just these mountains that occurred, in a very linear fashion. And, a lot of them, largely had to do and fell under the umbrella of the skill of dieting and the skill of being able to embrace the suck that comes with doing the exact opposite of what physically your body wants to do. And I think early on, it's hard to stay patient. It's hard to have faith that really what you're doing is going to accumulate into something. But being able to continue to do that without seeing the immediate payoff, without seeing the results of what you're working on day in and day out instantly, I think that is one of the biggest advantages that you have against your competition. And this, I said this today in the webinar, I'm you don't have to be a physique athlete or have any interest in the bodybuilding space to be someone who lives a lifestyle where you take your physique into your own hands and you work towards goals and better outcomes and building the body that you want to have. And really one of the primary motivations that I have in sharing my own troubles, all the things that I go through, is that I want you to know that these things can last a long time, and you might not find the answer readily available. A lot of the answers that I have today, I sought after them for years, and I was probably looking in the wrong place. But many of these were questions that I kind of just sat with. I'm I know there's an answer out there. And when I find it, I'm telling you, I'm going to capitalize on that information. I'm going to make sure this is not something that I have to continue to, relearn this lesson or continue to be tested by the same boss, the discomfort that you feel, associated with whatever phase you're in, whether that's fat loss, whether that's building, whether the struggle that you currently are experiencing is related to not knowing how to string together, bouts of adherence, or not having faith that you're doing the right thing in terms of your training, not knowing should I just take PEDs? Is this what everyone seems like they're doing? So maybe that's the one missing link. It's everyone else is feeling that same discomfort, or they do feel that same discomfort in their own way. And a lot of people, I think it's very normal to have doubt associated with the process, because truly, when you're talking about making monumental changes to your body, these are not things that are going to happen overnight. And even in the course, like, I mean, when you compare like fat loss versus building, it's like fat loss is the easy part. Fat loss is the part where like you get that dopamine response. And like, if you're in a big enough deficit, like I'm telling you, like you can like get a system going, you can like see that progress very quickly, like over the course of very few days. And like the leaner that you get, the less you need to lose for that progress to really be noticeable and to really stand out. And I think a lot of people look to receive positive reinforcement that they're doing the right thing. And really, I would say like the leading indicator of someone who's going to be successful within our sport comes down to like being able to act and to continue to do what it is that you need to do without anything happening, without any kind of reinforcement. And where I'm at, I'm in a place in my journey where I don't get a lot of like positive reinforcement. And that's not like, oh, give me positive reinforcement. It's like I don't share a lot of like the off-season updates. I don't post my physique really that much in this phase, because frankly, like that's what I need to do. Like that's like comfortable for me, is like, you know, just really honing in on like what I'm doing and sharing honestly what I'm comfortable with, what I feel like confident is actually helpful, what I feel very certain in. And I think a lot of people think that, okay, like if they're doing everything right, and if they're doing enough of these things right, then eventually you just get to a point where you don't care as much. You don't need, you know, that encouragement, that you figure out how to deal with however much motivation you have that day. And I think there's definitely something to that. A lot of the progress that you see when you're going through a build, it's going to happen slower than you expect. And then really the first moment in which you get to see that really accumulate into something, it's going to appear as if it all happens then, is that next fat loss phase. And people expect the muscle building, they expect, you know, the shaping, the molding, the bodybuilding part of, you know, this sport. They expect that to happen fast, because I think inversely, people like put fat loss really on a pedestal as like, okay, this is where it sucks, this is where it's hard, and they imagine that like, well, if that part must be hard, then the inverse of this must be easier, because you get more flexibility with food choices and you get to eat more and you don't have to feel nearly as shitty, then this ultimately must be easy. And then that's where people oftentimes find that they're disappointed, because the speed doesn't really match the vision. People will harp on measurements. I mean, like I try to get granular with some people who like really need to recalibrate expectations. I'm like, hey, let's like look at skin fold sites. So let's look at like your training performance. But I know these things, like they're not moving as fast as you want them to, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means this is the pace that we can move at, and any faster could have potential cost that you might not want to pay. Like, it might not actually worth it to pay that. I think one of the differences between experts and novices, beginners, is that people who have really mastered a skill set, they have ultimately found more ways to stay the course without getting distracted. They found more ways to, you know, hold on to their sense of purpose, their motivation, and have found ways to feel rewarded or to reward themselves in any given condition. And if you really think about it, like there's so many interactions that you can have that are good, that are reinforcing. And that's where it really is based on what you believe, like what actually moves the needle in terms of you staying the course. And I think like the goal is to develop enough of any skill that, you know, like, hey, I might not get that immediate gratification. I might be in the gym, like in the off season, let's say, for instance, in a build where it's like maybe even wearing a tank top, it's like you don't see the muscles, you don't see the lines, like your shape, you're like, okay, well, it's there, but I don't feel like this is representative of my best. But you know, the weight that you're lifting, the workouts that you're putting yourself through, the eating, the getting in food, even though it's well past the time you want to be up eating, these things all accumulate and eventually transpire into your next fat loss phase, giving you that reward. That's where you're provided better outcomes the next time you diet, is doing those things on repeat for an extended period of time with no gratification. And I think that's where a lot of people get it wrong, because they assume well, if I was doing the right thing, it would feel good. It would feel really good. I wouldn't have to work this hard to stay motivated. And I think crafting an environment and really crafting a dialogue with yourself, a belief within yourself, that allows this positive feedback loop, in spite of not necessarily getting that extrinsic or intrinsic reward. I was having a conversation with Jordan the other day, and we were talking about dissociation when it came to body composition, but more specifically, what's worse, the dissociation when you're in a gaining phase or when you're in a losing phase, when you're in a cut or build. And for me, it really comes down to what is the more immediate goal in the future. What's the thing that I'm envisioning is okay, here's the reason that I'm doing the day in and day out. And that's where when I'm getting ready for a show, that becomes very clear. It's I am doing the Mile High, I'm doing the Pittsburgh Pro. I have these shows and I'm I can picture it. And I know generally working back what that's going to look like and how that's going to feel. I know what aspects are going to be out of my control. I know which ones are going to be in my control. And I have a very clear idea. Whereas if you're just losing body fat aimlessly, there's a big benefit in terms of personal development and skill that can come from not having that clear, okay, this is getting me towards what, rather than it's this event, this finish line. Instead, it's just this is making me better. These habits are making me better at this skill. I'm developing the skill of dieting. I'm just developing the skill of patience. And I think where a lot of people go wrong is they will latch on to a single event and be I need this to stay motivated. I need this to work towards, because without it, I don't think I'm motivated. I don't think I can stay on track. And it kind of bums me out, because I'm really okay, so you don't want to, I guess a better example would be someone who's trying to get ready for a Tough Mudder or Spartan race or something. It's you don't want to get stronger or faster. You just want to prep for this single event. You just want to go so that you can have a good time and you can enjoy yourself. But it comes down to entertainment, not necessarily athletic development, not necessarily I'm trying to craft myself, because crafting the skill needed to do well at said event, and this applies to majority of sports, that isn't just a matter of crossing the finish line and getting on stage or getting on the platform or entering the race and participating. It's it's decoupling the skills that it takes to do well in any of these arenas. And some of those skills that you need, when you talk about okay, what do I need to do to be successful on a bodybuilding stage? Well, depending on the division, you need a certain degree of muscularity. You need a certain degree of conditioning. You need some degree, some skill set of presentation. Obviously, the better you are at these things and the more seamless they come to you, the better you can do them without necessarily having to foster them or work on them. But really, if I had to map out what are the 3 most important skills that will allow you to be successful on the bodybuilding stage, this comes down to being able to act when you should, to be able to not act when you shouldn't, and to be able to be patient really throughout any kind of season phase that you're going through. There are phases that we go through as bodybuilders that no matter how disciplined you might feel, you are still going to have to execute, exercise willpower to an extent that is uncomfortable. And the ability to feel these levels of discomfort and continue to say, okay, but what is the plan? The plan is to not do X, Y, and Z. So I'm not going to do that. The plan is to do this, and this. So I'm going to do that. The plan, regardless of how it feels, even if I feel very uncomfortable, is to get on this stage and get on this stage in seemingly really good shape. So in order to do that, I have to continue to lose fat. In order for me to lose fat, that means that I can't just act on impulse in this moment, even though that impulse is going to return and probably be very persistent for every moment between now and then the show. And then it's going to continue after the fact. And that's where I think working on these skills in isolation and working on them to a volume and at a frequency in which they become second nature, I really think is what's going to allow you not just to do well on a bodybuilding stage, but is what's going to give you the control over your body composition that you're so keen on. And I think for me, what really allowed me to move the fastest forward just in my own athletic development was focusing less on what I was feeling and trying to find a solution to resolve that feeling, but rather, what are the actions I'm committed to making? What are the things that I agreed to do in order to compete in this sport or in order to be successful in this very acute endeavor? And do those commitments still align with overall what I want and what I need to be fulfilled and to be happy? And is this feeling, is it stronger than those commitments? And I think when I started to force myself to confront, are these feelings stronger than those commitments, it became very apparent. It's like, no, like the feeling of slight discomfort, the feeling of, I feel very fatigued, the feeling of I don't feel motivated, I don't want to lift, I don't want to work out hard, I want to go home, I want to sleep, I want to eat whatever I want and not have to think twice about whether or not this is going to set me back. Those are all transient and they do pass. I know they pass because they resurface as well, just as quickly. So for me, I think there's a power in being able to break down. It's like, okay, let's do an inventory on the skills that you're missing that ultimately would allow you to be much better at doing the thing that you're trying to do. So maybe that isn't bodybuilding, but maybe that's like, hey, I want to do fat loss. I want to wake up and not think twice about the clothes that I put on my body, or think if this outfit, if I am lean enough, skinny enough to wear it. I just want to be able to go into my closet, close my eyes, put on whatever I want, and feel like, okay, no matter what I put on, I'm going to feel confident in it. Well, that isn't like that confidence, that skill of confidence that I think people tend to associate as like things that you were born with, things that people just have. And I don't think that's true. I think it's something that we foster or we snuff out. And I think a lot of times what will happen is people will begin to make comparisons to people who are like completely, like they're not at all in competition with, just comparisons to like, well, this girl's getting ready for this show and she seems to handle her off season well. And this is generally how I want to be. So if I'm not where she is, then I'm not doing things correctly. And I think that's where we go wrong, because we're using a reference point that is not relative to where we are in our own personal development. But why is that tough? It's tough because it takes being very honest, being brutally honest about things that I believe are very vulnerable to each of us. So by doing this, you demystify the ambiguity with like, well, how is she so motivated? How does he just have this like super high work ethic? And really what it comes down to is like, there's this huge disconnect between what people want, how they describe what they want, and what it actually takes for them to get where they want to go and to achieve said thing. And that's the scary thing. Like, I've had people tell me like they think that I'm very confident on stage. They think that, my stage presence is, generally good. I feel like, okay, I don't necessarily feel that confidence because part of, my development in developing my stage presence has been just being very transparent with like, I'm not very comfortable. And comfortability is something I associate with confidence. Is like, okay, for me to be confident on stage, I need to feel very comfortable. And especially when I haven't been posing a lot, or it's not something that I'm, really like up to my knees in, it's certainly something like if I were to right now get on stage and pose, I'd be like, I don't feel the most comfortable because I'm very out of practice. And that's an important key component to feeling confident on stage. Like, for instance, I had a girl reach out. We were doing a consultation. We were talking about training. She's like, do you work with anyone like on mindset? Like, did you ever work with someone yourself to work on your mindset as it came to like feeling like you belong on stage? Like, how did you like combat imposter syndrome? And truly, like, I don't think that I have imposter syndrome. I don't think that that's necessarily what I've had in the past. I think I've just looked at my skill set and I've honed in on areas that frankly are very, very underdeveloped or underdeveloped relative to how developed I want them to be. And that like brash realization has made this sense of urgency for me to be like, oh, like I need to focus on this. I need to, okay, if I want to be successful, that means I need to work towards this. And I think sometimes that urgency, that like almost like anxious energy can really cloud your view of yourself. And in my case, like it very much has made me feel like, okay, like if I want to be successful, there isn't a lot of room in the development process. I just need to get there. And that can be a little overwhelming, but at the same time, I think it's very unrealistic to just expect yourself to not have this skill developed and then just immediately know what you need to do in order to be an expert at this. And I would say like, in the instance with like dieting is a great example of something that a lot of people, they can feel like, I am not someone who knows how to be adherent. I'm not someone who knows how to make good choices when willpower is low. That's where I find it really helpful. And I try to do this with clients is like parse out, like, what are the 18 things that you need to do and you need to be aware of, or you need to at least consider, you need to ask yourself in order for you to be someone who feels confident in your ability to follow a diet, in order for you to feel like you can be adherent. And I think a lot of this comes down to being able to pause and understand like, okay, what is my goal? What is the thing that I'm working towards? I'm working towards getting leaner. So is what I'm about to consume, is this in line with that goal? And if it's not in line, okay, am I comfortable with the consequences of this not being in line? Do I have enough wiggle room? Do I have this slush fund that essentially would allow me to get away with eating off track? I think a lot of people just jump to the conclusion like, okay, I'm either on plan or I'm not on plan, and there's no in between, and there's no forgiveness and there's no context, and it doesn't matter if this is somewhat trackable. If I'm on plan, I'm on plan, and if I'm not, I'm not. And I think when you really break down the context and the decision making around individual foods, I think all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier to metabolize. And you're like, okay, well, this is what it takes in order for me to go out to eat and not make shithead decisions that ultimately will make me feel like crap tomorrow when I go and get on the scale. It's like, I could give you a handbook and tell you like, hey, these are the things you need to be aware of. Here are the 10 things that you need to be aware of as soon as the food comes out. You need to consider whether or not there are additional calories, whether that be in oil or in sauces. Does the portion sizing look correct? Do you feel like it's cooked in a way that, potentially in the future, you could have ordered it to be cooked that would result in a lower total calorie intake for the meal? Did you plan accordingly going into the meal? Did you budget enough calories that the total amount of calories you're eating at this meal out is still within a reasonable amount that you can assume you're not going to be too far off track? Did you plan to have a rest day today, even though you knew you were going to have an untracked meal? Do you plan to have a rest day tomorrow? And is that in line with you reaching your goal of losing body fat, assuming that now we know you're probably going to be over in calories today, and this could even be a more sedentary day as a whole. So maybe in the future, it would make sense if you had a training day planned on the day of your cheat meal as well as the day afterwards. But in actuality, it's not that easy. Like, I can give you a guide. I can make a fucking ebook and just be like, oh yeah, here's your checklist for when you go out to eat. Here are all the things that you need to think about. But the reality is some of these things you don't need to think about. Some of these things are second nature to you, and you already have the answers because you just do this innately. And for other people, I might be pointing out things that are very obvious, and they're like, oh, well, I do the opposite of this every time I go out to eat. So I can't imagine doing anything differently. And that's where having that exposure, not only being able to make the decision that you believe is the best decision that's in line with your interest, but then being able to reflect and audit, like, was this actually the best decision? Or was I acting off emotion? Was I acting off of impulse? That to me is the key. And that is like, if you want to learn something, like, I'm immediately thinking, okay, what do I have to do? And if this isn't something that we can like break down and be like, this is what you have to do and this is what you shouldn't do, if we can't define like clear boundaries, then I mean, I start to question whether or not there's actually a criteria with like the goal in mind. So in the case of like, I want you to be mindful when you go out to eat, that's pretty ambiguous. For some people, that could very well mean that like, I'm going to go out and I am only going to have a salad. I'm not going to get dressing, any toppings on it, like croutons or cheese, I'm going to order on the side, and I'm going to get chicken breast. But if there's any oil on the chicken breast, then I'm only going to eat half of it. That's pretty restrictive. And maybe for some people that actually is what they need to do based on their goal. Maybe you're in a bit of a time crunch, and because of maybe a deadline that you have, you know, relative to a show, maybe you can't afford to have a meal that isn't 100% tracked. But in that case, I mean, like, wouldn't it also be true that maybe when you go out to eat, if you go out to eat at all, the answer isn't to even eat? It's just to go and, you know, enjoy the experience of being around, you know, the company that you're with. But the focus shouldn't necessarily be on necessarily getting food in, because the food is not 100% trackable. And that's where you have one camp over here where that end of the spectrum is quite the reality for some individuals. But then you have the other end of the spectrum where it's like, me saying be mindful is like, okay, when we go out, I'm going to have one dessert with my partner and we're just going to split it. We're not going to each get our own, but we're still going to get appetizers. We're still going to get full entrees, but I'm just going to pull back a little bit on that final treat. And like, people want to have these very strict and rigid like rules and be like, okay, well, when I go out to eat, I only do X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't challenge you to develop autonomy around food behaviors. It doesn't put you in a position where there is a degree of balance that's required. Like having like just hyper restrictive, hyper rigid, you know, this is how I eat 100% of the time unless I'm going off track. It doesn't put you in a position of power. It puts you in a position where going out to eat is the liability. Like, not having control of your food is something that will always be problematic. And really, when it comes down to like being able to learn, like, you get a return on learning from an experience. And the only downfall is if like you come out of an experience, you're like, okay, well, that wasn't the outcome that I was hoping for. But rather than do an audit, rather than reflect and figure out, okay, what would have allowed me to be at least closer to the desired outcome, you just move on and say, whatever. Listening, reflecting, learning, these are the things that are going to give you the highest return on your effort, even if your effort results in an outcome that you didn't necessarily desire. And eventually, if you do learn, you should be in a position, like you should be able to put yourself in that position where you're closer to that desired outcome. And that's the thing about learning, is like, there are some people that do learn from being negatively reinforced, but I think positive reinforcement, I think, is a much stronger motivation when it comes to breaking habits and developing a new skill. And I think specifically when we're talking about food behaviors and like taking control of your body composition, whatever that actually looks like in terms of the final goal, I think that there's a lot of effort that goes into, you know, understanding what must happen. But that effort is misplaced and put into really the weeds of like, okay, well, should I wear a waist trainer to make my waist smaller? Should I not have fruit in my afternoon meal because I won't have enough time to burn through those carbs later in the day? Whereas like the focus really has got to be on the things that are really much more simple and rudimentary. And I think if you can take those things that absolutely, like the non-negotiables that must happen, like for instance, in the case of fat loss, like you need to be in a deficit. In the case of hypertrophy, you need to be in a surplus. And we can simplify these into behaviors. So how do we create a deficit? How do we create a surplus? We monitor our food intake, because most people aren't going to be very honest, not because they're shit people, just because it's very difficult to be honest about hunger signaling, and actual hunger signaling can be very overpowering when it comes to determining if you've had enough or you've had too little. And And depending on where that settles for you, I mean, you could be someone who very much leans on the side of under eating. So maybe fat loss does come a little easier to you. But when it comes to hypertrophy, it's something that you have to like really berate yourself to make sure that you get enough food in order to build muscle. But I think simply demystifying these goals and breaking them down into target behaviors and like, okay, what needs to happen? Well, what is causing you to not act in accordance with your goal? Okay, you're not losing weight. So by definition, your goal is to lose weight. You're not losing weight. Why are you not losing weight? Because you're not in a deficit. So why are you not in a deficit? Because you don't know that you're not in a deficit. Okay, well then that's a knowledge gap we can fill very, very quickly. We can have you track in a food diary. And okay, well, you don't have the skill set to track in a food diary because you don't know how to estimate the weight against gravity in grams of these foods because you've never done that. You've never eyeballed that. Okay, so we buy a food scale and then we make sure that it becomes a habit that every time you eat something that you weigh it in grams or in ounces or in mls and you log it into your diary. Okay, well then the next deficit is, it's kind of a pain in the ass. Well, is it really a pain in the ass to take the bowl that you were going to put on the counter anyway and put it on a scale and like look at it and compute what the numbers say, and then to go into your phone and probably scan the thing that you're eating and then log the 80 grams of whatever, and then okay, that tells me I have this amount of budget. There are more steps to it, but the alternative is to eyeball things and to guess. And sure, maybe there's a season for that. Maybe there's a time where that makes the most sense. But I think for a lot of people, particularly the ones that are very motivated to understand what they're doing and develop these skills, I think this is where tracking and just being very like granular with, okay, what are the things that are not allowing me to see results? I can never gain muscle. Okay. Why can't you gain muscle? Well, I don't know. I'm working out. I'm eating a lot of food, but my weight's going down or my weight's not going up. So if your weight's not going up, you're not in a surplus. You should probably be in a surplus if you're trying to gain muscle. Like we do have to see that the weight's going up in order to ensure that muscle is actually being accrued, even if it's going up very gradually. Well, I don't like weighing myself every morning. Why don't you like weighing yourself every morning? This is where understanding the whys and the cognitions behind these beliefs that are now behaviors is really important. And like, yes, there might be multifacets of like ways you can, change your behavior, but ultimately I don't think that the behaviors that need change are nearly as complex as you would imagine. And like when we start getting into the weeds around like, okay, I don't know if I'm willing to actually be adherent. I don't know if I'm willing to give up what I need to give up to do the thing that I want to do. So you want to lose fat, but that means like, hey, on Fridays you go out and you have a whole pizza and you have wings and a dessert and you have a couple beers. And then the next 3 days you really extend yourself with like dropping carbs, doing a lot of cardio. You feel like shit. By the middle of the week, by like Tuesday, Wednesday, you get there and you're like, I can't wait till Friday again. Like I'm going to eat even more than I ate last time. So you have this vicious cycle that ultimately is putting you into this like yo-yo of binge, restrict, which it's not moving you in a very linear direction, if at all in a positive direction towards your goals. That's where you have to ask, okay, well, I can either give up the goal of losing weight or I can give up the experience, the pleasure that comes from having the ability, the flexibility to really go out, eat however I want. And as long as I pull back the next 3 days, I can do the same thing every single week. But the cost of that is not reaching your goals. It's not reaching your goals any sooner while this behavior is still taking place. And I think that's where it's really started to resonate with me when I started to frame it like, instead of, okay, well, I'm making this sacrifice, it's like, no, I'm trading the discomfort later and I'm experiencing that discomfort now, that same discomfort I'm experiencing today, because that will create a more comfortable future for me down the line. And I know like people, they want to say, well, hey, this is selfish. I don't have the means to be selfish. I don't have the means to take control of my body composition. Like that's going to require a completely different shift in behaviors and habits. And it's like, I understand, like, it can be uncomfortable to express boundaries. Like, it can be really difficult, especially if you've lived with someone for a long time or you're in an environment where people are pretty resistant to change. But this is where, I mean, like, you absolutely owe it to yourself to do the things that you need to do to reach a better health outcome. And sure, like, it doesn't sound all nice when you're like, okay, I want to feel better about my body. And people can often like minimize and be like, oh, that's really selfish and like really vain. Like, why are you going to inconvenience me in order for you to like how you look better? And when you really unpack that, it's like the people that are around you, the people that are deeply involved in your life, your relationship should be supportive of the goals that you have at hand. And like, this is the part that really irks me. Like, I have a girl, I'll tell you a story. I have a client who, she's in contest prep right now. She's in a newer relationship. And she told me like, it's a hardship. Like, I feel bad because like the relationship is having to take a back seat. I'm not able to be as nurturing and like caring as I normally would be. And I'm like, okay, but what about in the case where you have any kind of goal that's not related to your physique? What about if this was like a career endeavor that you were like chasing after? What if there was something that, you know, you're taking care of your mom or you're taking care of your dad because they need more of your attention? Like, can the relationship survive if that means that you have other things outside of the relationship? You have other priorities. Because for a long time, I was that person that didn't prioritize anything outside of the relationship I was in. And I made that my only priority. And then anything that threatened that, really, it came into question whether or not it had a place. And I think long term, I think this is a very quick way to develop a lot of resentment. I think it's also a quick way to be very regretful and really to like put yourself in this state of mind where it's like, wait, I work really hard. Like, why the fuck am I putting all of my goals second, third, fourth, fifth? And that's where I would try to separate the two, is like, okay, there are degrees of selfishness that are acceptable at different phases. And I understand like contest prep is one that is going to require a lot of attention away from outside relationships and other priorities. However, it doesn't have to be something that is completely consuming. It doesn't have to be something that, you know, you feel you have to pick between your goals or the relationship. Like, you can absolutely find some semblance of balance in between the two with respect to what is needed for each one. So like this same client, she asked me, she's like, how do you stay motivated? And really it, you know, kind of struck me. I was like, I don't know how to answer that, because really the term motivation kind of escapes me sometimes. And this sent me down like a path of like, what does motivation actually mean to me? And the definition, or at least like the feeling that I came up with, was like, okay, when I feel motivated, it's very easy for me to act. Like, I don't have a lot of pause, or I don't have any reservations before I do something. Like, I'm just very quick, like, yes, I'm going to do it regardless. I'm not going to make this a conditional behavior. You know, and I kind of associate it with the feeling of like second guessing, like, should I do this? Like, is this worth doing it? Like, I don't really overthink when I'm motivated. And like in this context, she was asking me like relative to like her own motivation, because she's like, I'm really struggling like with food behaviors around food, and I'm in a contest prep. And I just want to know, like, you know, what keeps you on track? What allows you to be in that state? So I kind of gave her my definition. I was like, well, I feel like the ease in which I can take action is a very good litmus for me to know whether or not I'm motivated. And that for me ties directly into my why, because if I'm very confident in my why, if I know exactly why I'm doing something and I feel like it is the correct direction to move forward, then there's not a lot of pause. There's not a lot of reservation with acting. And I think like another interesting way to look at this is like, you are typically the most motivated. You typically have the least hesitation to act when you believe in what you're doing, when you feel convicted in the path that you're on. And I think even more so like the feeling of, you know, feeling enlightened or feeling like encouraged to move forward. I mean, I think that really manifests when you are in a state that is the opposite of deprivation. And I think oftentimes people will feel really motivated when you've been deprived of whatever it is that you're chasing. So like a very obvious example for me right now is like, hey, I could diet. I could diet right now. Like I could start dieting tomorrow and put myself in a really big deficit because it's been months since I've had to be restrictive. I could get on the treadmill, and the first time I do cardio, I could go in and not think twice about it because it's like, hey, I feel that motivation in order to do something that I haven't really had to exercise a lot of willpower recently on. Now, I talk about this in respect to dietary fatigue because I think a lot of people, they, get down into the weeds of like perma dieting, and they forget that like there is dietary fatigue accumulating in the background. And no matter how long you've been on a diet, that duration is going to cause some kind of movement of the needle of dietary fatigue. And really, like, the thing that irks me is that no matter how much weight you've lost, the amount of time that you perceive that you've been dieting, whether you've actually lost weight or not, that is going to accumulate in the background. And it's not something you can just ignore. You think about it like, when is the time that you are motivated to sleep? Like the most motivated to sleep? It's probably when you're sleep deprived. When are you motivated to eat? It's probably when you have felt starved. And if we're talking about like chronic periods of feeling underfed, under-recovered, these things might be persistent to a point where they never go away. And really, like, when I start to peel back the layers of like, for me, what allows me to reignite motivation, it comes down to my perception of how much effort something is going to take and how hard it is to maintain. So like I take the term runway and I frame it almost like, okay, what is the max amount of time or the predicted amount of time that I can continue to do the behavior, do the action that I'm currently doing without any kind of interference or resistance. And I think really like your perception of how hard something is plays a major role in your runway as well as your motivation. For instance, like someone who's been shredded, who's been at like 12, 15%, if they get up to like 25 body fat percentage, and of course I'm talking about women, this might feel very excessive. Whereas like, on the other hand, someone who's reached just 25% coming down, I mean like 25%, every percentage down might feel like a huge monumental like milestone. And for them, like that is a major accomplishment. They absolutely should be proud of that. But it's these reference points that ultimately shape us and put us in positions as to whether or not we have the capability, we have the skill set to continue moving forward. And this is like a really tricky way that I like to kind of use it on myself, like reverse psychology. I try to think like, okay, what is the thing that I'm not getting right now that I want? Okay, if we can operationalize this, that thing, whatever it is, let's map out like what are the exact actions that need to happen that if I do them for long enough and I do them well, will almost guarantee that I achieve whatever it is that I'm after. And I think one of the biggest limiting factors is being honest with yourself, because that does take just a high degree of vulnerability to address like, what are the things that are preventing me from getting where I'm trying to go? And I think this is really your starting point. If you don't have a clear idea of where you're trying to go, identify that. Once you have that down, once it's a very clear idea, once you know, okay, this is said destination, it's input into maps. Now you have to think about, okay, what is the most effective way to get there? That isn't typically going to be just doing a show, getting on a platform, entering a race, doing a fat loss challenge. It's usually going to start with identifying what are the skills that I do not have or I currently have that need addressed and honestly need fostered. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. As always, thank you guys for watching. I will see you in the next one.